Hello, welcome to this FileMaker video. My name is Matt Petrowski. I'm going to be your instructor, and we are taking a look at a topic today of FileMaker's file options. This is one of the last areas that we're going to take a look at with regards to the environment of FileMaker. You're here to learn about FileMaker, so let's dive into the video and see what we're talking about. As I switch to my desktop here, every once in a while when I'm looking off to the side, I'm just looking at another monitor, so I'm not distracted. We are here to learn about these settings right here under the File menu of the File Options. Now, the File Options is where you get to control the number one feature, which is the startup and the shutdown process of your FileMaker file. So if you've not set this on your FileMaker file and you're new to FileMaker, you absolutely want to set this setting. But there's more in this dialog that we're going to be taking a look at. So if you'd like to follow along, my suggestion would be to choose a new solution, not the Get Started I was highlighted on, but a new solution. I've already done that. I've created a new solution, and I simply called mine Startup, if you'd like to follow along. So I'll just bring my window up that I have right here. So as with all FileMaker database systems, well, at least as of the shooting of this video, here in FileMaker 16, which is a copy that I'm using, it's actually FileMaker Advanced. If you have a copy of FileMaker Pro and you do not have this Tools menu, I can't suggest enough that you get access to developer tools, because as you're learning, this script debugger and this data viewer are immensely helpful, but we won't need them for today's video. So with this startup file selected, you have to have a FileMaker file open, of course. Once a FileMaker file is open, you're going to make a trip to the File menu and you're going to choose your option of File Options. Now when this dialog comes up, let me back off here a little bit and then we'll zoom in and get that centered on screen. All right, so what we are looking at in this dialog are all of the different options or settings that you have with regards to FileMaker's environment. Now the first one that we can see right here, this minimum version allowed to open this file. That is going to be a setting right there where you can set whatever version is required. Now, here's the key thing to remember about this. When you create a new FileMaker in a later version of FileMaker, notice that I'm in FileMaker 16, yet when the file was created, it says that the minimum version that FileMaker that is required to open this file is 12. Now, this becomes a little bit of an issue for us, because if we are developing a file and we are using FileMaker 16 features, guaranteed FileMaker 12, 13, 14, depending on the feature, will not be available in those older copies of FileMaker. So I don't know why FileMaker doesn't set this initially to the version that corresponds in which you're actually creating the file. Or if you've created a file or working with a file that was created with a much older copy of FileMaker, then it's advisable to at least change this to the bare minimum required. So where do you figure out what minimum version you would actually need to use for this solution? Let's take a quick trip to the web. I'll switch over to Safari here, and I will do a Google search really quickly here. Let me see. I'm just going to put an application version. I did this in yesterday's video just to get to FileMaker's documentation, FileMaker.com. So basically all I'm doing is I'm limiting my search to FileMaker's website so that it brings up just any function that I happen to remember in order to access FileMaker's help. I'll go to the Get Application version, and once we're here, I'm going to click on the root here of the icon. Let me bring up my highlighter. I forgot to load that here. There we go. This clicking up here in the top, that will actually activate the help. Now I forget where it is in here. FileMaker Pro Basics. Let's go. This is how I actually usually get to it, to find out what does FileMaker support in which version, because you need to know these things. I click on the New Features, which is the first link after you click on the FileMaker Pro Basics. It's that New Features. And then what I do is I just scroll all the way to the bottom. I just did that with my mouse super fast. And then down at the bottom there, you see this one that says Related Topics, FileMaker Pro features not compatible with previous versions. So this is a one help page that's really pretty nice, that as I zoom out here, it actually tells you when things were released in which versions, so that you at least know what you should be setting that setting to. So we can see right here, if I'm in fact going to be using button bars, then at a bare minimum, I should be setting that to FileMaker 14. So again, because FileMaker sets it to FileMaker 12 and later, you have to know that there's actually older versions that have some bugs in them that have security holes. So this is a good thing to know and a good thing to set. And I think some developers, they just leave it there set as whatever they want to set it as. So if I'm developing something I know that requires button bars, I'm going to change this minimum version to at least the version that's required. And if I'm starting brand new fresh with FileMaker 16, I'm just going to set it to 16. There's no point in any older version of FileMaker being able to open my file. So there's that one. Now the next one is really pretty cool because what happens is by default, every new FileMaker file that you create has to have at least a minimum of one account, and that one account has to be specified to a developer account. And it's set to all FileMaker files start with admin and blank. And by default, in order to get into that file, FileMaker has to open with a given username, and in this case, a blank password. Once you set up your security, which we took a look at probably video 3 or video 4 in this series, you can uncheck this box because really anytime that a FileMaker file comes up, at least through the web, through FileMaker server, you want users to actually input their username and password. So you just uncheck that box. But that's not the only way that you can use this one particular feature. There is a way to do things, and you really need to know what you're doing. This goes into the world of more advanced FileMaker development called privilege escalation. When you are going to start a user at a very low level of privileges and then escalate them based on what they know, then you would be able to say log in with an account that you've created that is something like low level or access only, whatever you want to call it. You're going to give it a password, and you would put the password in here, whatever the password is. That means that every time this file is opened, it's opened with the privilege set associated with this particular account. Now, in FileMaker, it has script steps. Remember, FileMaker is just an automation environment where you can allow that user to either re-log in or you can automatically bump them up to another account. Now, the one caveat that I'm going to give you to doing this is that FileMaker security and privilege sets are the absolute final say-so in your file. If you're going to do this privilege escalation type of process, you really need to know that you've protected the data that you want protected and that this file really isn't that easy to find on the internet. There are ways where advanced FileMaker developers can go out, search the web, look for FileMaker servers, they're not hard to find, and start to just go poke around. So if you use this method, realize that anybody who finds your server or the IP address or the domain of where it's at, if you basically log the user in at a low level, you better make sure that you're not exposing any data or any methods where a user could hack into that file. Otherwise, your best bet is just to have it unchecked. That requires a user to have a username and a password. So that's a good thing to know about. Keychain access. This is one that came about, I think FileMaker 16 released this. If not 16, it was just the version prior to when I'm shooting this video, 15. This is where you check on a file-by-file basis whether you allow the operating system to actually save the password so that when the file is opened, if it's opened on the user's machine and they've saved the password, then the file just opens up without actually prompting them. So you get to decide whether or not that's something that the user can do. And here, if we do turn this on, we have the further option that says require iOS passcode. And this is where you can, on FileMaker Mobile, when you're using it on an iPhone or an iPad, actually allow them to use, I think this is the Touch ID, or the passcode where they're able to actually do that. And that requires them to actually use their Touch ID, and coming up here, I guess the Face ID, which Apple's going to release. Now, the next critical setting in the File Options dialog is this one right here, Switch to Layout. When you turn on this setting, this means that this is the very first layout that FileMaker is going to go to. And I've shot a really good video here on YouTube that you can look at called Startup Splash Screens. And that basically talks about the fact that when you're going to start FileMaker up, whatever layout that table occurrence is associated to and the data that's in that table that layout will show, FileMaker will attempt to preload all of that data. So if there's 10,000 records, FileMaker is going to attempt to load a small subset of those records first. If you want the fastest possible startup, you'll designate a layout that's tied to a table that's basically empty. Because what happens at that point, FileMaker starts up on that layout, it goes to a table, that table has no data, and then you get to decide where you want to take the user. Because not all users are equal. Not everybody coming into the system wants to do the same thing. That's where you get to decide. Now, this is the first of two places where you can set it, and this is the one that I will set by default to typically what I just said, a blank layout tied to an empty table. You need to know that there are three ways that FileMaker determines what layout should it start up when the file is loaded. The first one is whatever the last layout the user was on when the file was closed, that's the layout that it's going to use when it starts up. The second in order is switching to the layout, the setting on the file options, which we're seeing right here. So depending on whatever happened when the file was closed, if I set this option, then it really doesn't matter. FileMaker will now choose this layout when the file is opened. The third option is to control what layout we go to within a script, and we're going to see that's in the script triggers section right up here. We'll be getting to that. Now, we also have this option, I believe this is a new one to FileMaker 16, to hide all toolbars. So if you want to be able to ensure that the toolbars are going to be hidden and then you control when they get turned on, that's where you'll use this option. Now, the icon is going to be pretty obvious. You're probably going to want to search FileMaker's help in order to get the dimensions. I don't know the dimensions off the top of my head for setting the icon. Now, the only place that this icon shows up is it doesn't show up on the file when it's in the operating system or on the desktop. It shows up in what FileMaker calls its launch center. And I'm sure you've seen that. It comes up with FileMaker anytime no file is opened. It presents you with an option of any of your favorite files, and that's where this icon is controlled. You only get to load one version, make sure it's the larger version, and then FileMaker creates the smaller versions for you. There are some presets, which FileMaker released, I think in FileMaker 14 or 13, where you can choose that icon that FileMaker has. If it doesn't work for you, you can click the custom right here, or you can choose custom up at the top. Same difference in terms of what you're going to choose. And once you've got the icon selected, you can choose scale to fit, and there's scale to size. There's a few others that you have in there. I don't know if it shows. Let's see if it does show. No, it's only when you're going to do your custom that you're going to get that option. So now let's talk about the file options for spelling. Okay, this setting in the file options is a global setting, meaning globally in the whole of my file, do I want spelling to actually show up as questionable words? Now, questionable words just means you're going to get that dotted red line underneath words where there's questionable spelling. Now, if you never want that to happen in the whole of your file, then you want to uncheck that here because this is the global setting. But don't worry, you have a companion setting where on a field by field basis and also with text blocks or text objects on the layout, you can turn that on or off in the inspector palette. So in general, if you do want spelling to be checked, you're probably going to leave this option on. You also have the check spelling as you type. This can get pretty annoying if you've got a lot of bad spellers. That's why it's currently set to off. I can beep on questionable spellings. If I could say questionable, that's what you would have. Now, text is going to come into play when you've got foreign versions of FileMaker or international versions of FileMaker, and there's a critical piece of know-how as a FileMaker learner in this dialog. First off, if you want all of your text to be really pretty, then you're going to use smart quotes. If your FileMaker database is dealing with things related to code, I do not suggest turning this on because smart quotes are different than your standard quotes, and I tend to keep this turned off. I know when I want to use smart quotes in a particular field, and while we don't have an override for that within the inspector palette, I actually just manually put them in, or I will use what's known as an auto enter on a particular field so that that field, as soon as the contents are saved, it will convert all standard quotes to curly quotes. That's something that puts more of the control in my hands as the developer, so I don't tend to turn this on. And then these, you will know if they apply to you: Asian language line breaking or Roman language line breaking. Now down here at the bottom, this one is an interesting one, especially if you're watching this and you're not in the US or you're in an international version of FileMaker, is a file at the point in time that it's created within FileMaker is initially set to use the settings according to the locale of that file. So for example, if I was in Germany and I created the file using a German version of FileMaker, then it would probably have a date in the reverse order of what I expect in the US. Now that's a setting that's set onto the file, but this setting in the file options is where you can control what actually is used when those dates are viewed. Now you can't control it from the standpoint of when the file is created. If a file is created in a German version of FileMaker and you take it over to the US or open it with a US version, international version of FileMaker, you don't actually switch internally the fact of what those settings were. They can only be controlled here or using a script. One of your startup scripts can actually say use the system format that you want to use. So here you can decide whether you want to always use the file or ask when the settings are different, or always use the current system settings, which means if the user is using a system that uses a different date formatting, that's what it'll actually pick. But you can control this here. Now here's where we get to the last part, the most critical part of our file options for each FileMaker file that you create. So if you have files that are interacting with each other, each file needs to have these settings set. This is our first introduction as a new FileMaker learner to script triggers, is what FileMaker calls them. I think of them as events, and you can see that FileMaker even names them events right here with the keyword event. Events are basically anything that happens as a result of something else. So as a result of this file opening, the event that's going to happen, or the trigger in this case, is an on first window open or an on last window close. Now I suggest that on every FileMaker file, you actually link up these two, because inevitably you run into a situation where you want to have these. And FileMaker, which typically tries to be as helpful as it can, interestingly, does not actually create two scripts for you, a startup and a shutdown script, and link them here. We're also going to find a on window open and the on window close. Now, I have to be honest, I haven't used these a whole lot because I tend to create single window applications, and that's a decision that you have to make when you're starting your FileMaker database. Is the user pretty much going to interact with this with regards to just one single window, and I'm not going to bring up separate windows on the screen? On FileMaker Mobile, that really is the only option that you have. You can create new windows, but those new windows come in front of other windows, and you always only have one window view. But if you're creating a FileMaker application that's desktop based, and you want to watch for when users open certain windows and maybe correlate that against other environment conditions, such as if this user is a developer or if they're using this privilege set, these are the settings where you would be able to choose those. And finally, we have an on-file AV player change. Now, every one of these script triggers, they allow you to run a script. We can see as we cycle through them, FileMaker gives us the result of what's going to happen. And as I mentioned, we're going to always hook up a startup and a shutdown script. Now, I've seen these named all kinds of different things: log in, log out. I've even seen them named, and I named some of my triggers the same as what the trigger is: on first window open. As a matter of habit, I just call mine startup and shutdown, primarily because FileMaker calls the file options, well, this is file options for the name of my file startup, so this is sort of bogus what I'm about to say, but I just think of it as the startup process, or the boot up, or bootstrapping is what it can be called. So I'm going to check both of these, and because I don't initially have a script in my database, FileMaker will bring up the prompt for me to choose which script I want to use, and I don't have a script here. Unfortunately, I can click on the little plus to make a script. So when I make a script, FileMaker is going to bring up a dialog box allowing me to create the script, and I'm just going to call mine startup and say OK. Now, since we're here, I'll back this off a little bit. This is where we can discuss. We don't have to actually go into the script workspace. We're right here ready and able to actually start to add in steps in our script that would happen when the file was open. So this, again, is the second place where the file gets to decide where we want to take the user. So remember, the first place is if we don't have anything set on the file options, it's whatever the layout the user was on when the file was closed. The second one is we're going to set that startup option of the layout that we want to switch to. And if it's an empty layout, then FileMaker opens up really fast. The third option being this script now, I'm able to actually say, where do I want to take the user based on what conditions? And here I would be able to say, for example, put in an if step. And we saw get privileges yesterday. And I'm going to do this really simple little calculation. Data entry user. So we have a hypothetical situation here. We didn't go into security for this particular file and create a privilege set. If you're unfamiliar with privileges, go back to the video in this series where I talk about that, and you'll see that this would make sense. So here, I'm basically saying, if this FileMaker file, when it opens, runs the startup script, and the startup script says, if this user is using a privilege set of data entry user, then I want to take them to such and such layout. I would say go to layout. And then in this case, I don't have many other layouts. I haven't created them in this file. So we'll just have to use the only layout I have, startup. And you'll have to basically follow along as if you'd take them to another layout. So now let's add another condition. We just put in else. So this is an if, else, and if type of situation. And here I'm going to select the initial go-to layout. I'm going to hit Command D or Control D to duplicate that and just drag it down. And here I would be able to specify to go to a completely different layout. So this is the cool part of the file options on all of your files. You get to control ultimately what happens when that file starts up. Now I'm going to leave or wrap this video up with some information that you need to absolutely know when it comes to the startup process, because this is something that you will hit down the road no matter what. I'm going to add a little bit of code here, and I'm going to say if, and this may not make sense right off the bat, and I'm going to move these all the way to the top. And I'm going to say if, and I'm going to use one of our environment variables, which we've already learned about, get application version. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start to code a calculation function that's going to use multiple functions. So if you've never used multiple functions and embedded them within each other, we'll have a whole video about this. That's what we're going to do. I know that I'm going to be using other functions in order to get at a result, then in order to get my ultimate result. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to try to embed them into each other right here. I'm actually going to create a return. It just makes it easier for me to think about the problem that I'm trying to solve. Because what I'm trying to do right now is I'm trying to say, if this file opens up on FileMaker server, I want to do something different than if this file opens up in a regular copy of FileMaker Pro. So I know that get application version is going to tell me whether or not it's server or FileMaker Pro. But I need to take some of the information out of what it returns. So I know that I'm going to be using a left function because I want to use the left of that. And we'll have to go into the debugger and actually show you this if it doesn't make sense. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to now copy that or cut it from the left. I think this will actually do what I want. Let me see if we can make it a little bit wider. The number of characters. So now I have to know FileMaker is going to return something like this. Pro Advanced 16.0.2. I just happen to know that that's what this copy of FileMaker is going to return. If this was opened on FileMaker server, it would probably return, I think, server and then whatever the version number is. So what I'm going to do is, you know what? I'm actually making a mistake right here, but it's a good mistake to make. I would need to count how many characters there are if I use the left function. So I would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if it returns server, and I'd have to double check that by actually seeing what the result is FileMaker gives me, I would put the number of characters of 6 right here, and then I would say equals server. Now that's one way that I could approach this, but FileMaker has another function called left words. So this one actually is a little bit easier because FileMaker's, instead of me counting how many characters, FileMaker's just going to take the one word. So I'd rather use that one. I'm going to copy this one or cut it out of this. And I'm just going to look at the left word, just the first word. If that is equal to server, and I'm going to take all of the rest of this off and say OK, then what I want to do is I want to exit this script. Now this is going to be a little bit confusing, but it's absolutely something that you need to know, because down the road what you're going to be doing is there are two places where you can run a FileMaker script. You can do a perform script within the copy of FileMaker that's actually being used. And what that does is it runs on the local machine and it communicates back and forth with FileMaker server. But there's another script step that we have available to us in FileMaker, which is perform script on server. Now, when we perform a script on server, we're basically telling FileMaker, I don't want to do this here locally on the client because it'll probably lock up my machine and stop things from happening. I get this little cursor that shows a little period flashing back and forth with a little icon, and the user can't do anything. But a lot of scripts, if you tell them to just go run on FileMaker server, it will run it really fast and then get back to you. So what happens is our startup script here, it doesn't really make sense when we are going to tell FileMaker, hey, go run something on server, if the rest of this startup script, which server runs as well, any FileMaker file, wherever it's opened, no matter what opens it, server, FileMaker Go, FileMaker Pro, this script always runs. So if you think about this, does it make sense when this script is, when I tell FileMaker server using perform script on server to go run something on server, does it make sense that it determines what the privilege set is and whether it goes to this layout or this layout? Many times it doesn't. When you're performing a script on server, you just want it to go do something and do something quickly. Like go to this layout, get this data, perform some operations on it, and then put it into a field which will show up for me as the client. So this is a very critical piece of know-how, because a lot of FileMaker users, when they're new, they'll just create a really long, complex startup script. And that complex startup script is being run on server every time when they run a server-side script, and it really doesn't need to be. So you have to know that you can watch for this when the file is actually opened up. And so we can say OK right here, and we now have our startup. And likewise, I would click on the last window open, and here I'm just going to call a script called shutdown. And we're just going to do that one really quickly. I'm not going to add any steps, and that's going to give us the two critical steps that I actually set up on every file. And it's also our final area with regards to the file options. It also brings us right to our point where I'm about 28 minutes in, my nice 30 point where I like to leave you with the content so that you can think about it. Also give you the option to ask any questions if you're watching this on the live stream, and go through those as well. So that is the file options. I'm going to switch over to the chat, see if we've got any questions in order to cover here. And we'll go over to those questions and see what came up here. All right, HPH Group, thank you for checking in. Matt, 2 questions. Could you point us to a copy of your shutdown script, one that saves a series of rotating backups? Good question. I'll have to find that and probably put it into the comments down below. I copy and paste a lot of my code from a database that I actually created, and I'll be showing that at some point. It's available through the magazine website called FM Recipes. It's sort of hard to find, actually, where it really depends on what I'm actually doing. But in this particular case, this question about a shutdown script that saves copies, the shutdown script where you're going to save a copy of a database really only applies if that actual file is on the device or on the desktop. This applies in that scenario that we took a look at a few videos back, where we talked about the data separation model, where you use a data file that's hosted by FileMaker server, but then you use a local file that is an actual user interface file, and it connects to the data file in order to get the data. Now, if you want things to be saved in that local file and you want to have a backup of that file, Or let's say, for example, you're using a synchronization process where a copy of two FileMaker files are talking to each other. They're the same. One is on a client, on let's say a tablet device, and one is the same database is on server, and you're synchronizing the data between the two, but you want to save a backup of that local copy just in case the one that's open becomes corrupted. I don't know, the iPad closes down or something and could cause potential corruption. That is something that you would be able to wire up into the shutdown process. And basically, like I've been saying, with all of FileMaker, any function or menu command that you find available in the menus, a la the save a copy as, this will be an available script step within the scripts. And you basically just create a few other steps that say how you want to name it and things of that nature, and that's what I'll have to dig up and put in the comments. But if you want to save a copy of that file, you can certainly do it. And in later videos, we'll get to where it's saved and what you can do with it, how you can save it. You can even save the file, import it into a FileMaker container, and then attach it to an email that you shoot off somewhere else. Again, you can automate so many things in FileMaker. But because all of these menu commands are all available to us, doesn't matter whether it's startup or shutdown, you can definitely do what you want to do. And I'm so bad at switching to that and showing people things. Here's what I was talking about right here. Here's the menu command. Apologies. Save a copy as. This menu option is what I was actually showing when I was sitting there talking to you, and you're watching my big face while I'm talking. All right, let's see if there's any more questions that came in. All right, there are no more questions for today's particular video, so I think that's going to make this one. We're not going to go longer than 40 minutes, which is great. You've got some information here. I think I've done a good job of providing you with all of the content about the file options and how it works. I can't wait until we get into some of our upcoming videos where we're talking about planning out our FileMaker solution, and also how do we approach structuring the data, and then how do we actually start to wire things up. Before we do that, there's just a few more things we're going to need to know about the environment. That is basically a lot of stuff about fields and the relationship graphs, mistakes that are commonly made when wiring up table occurrences and connecting things up with regards to fields. So we'll be going over that in an upcoming video, and FileMaker's calculation engine. How do we approach FileMaker with regards to the fact that it's basically just one monster calculation engine. So I think that's going to do it for today. Let's cue up the music, switch to the subscribe, and you will be able to subscribe if you want to be notified via YouTube right there, and the next video in the series will be showing up right here. And other than that, much luck with your own development, and happy file making.